Thanks very much, Professor Cohen, and good afternoon, faculty and students. Thank you for inviting me to Johns Hopkins. It's a pleasure to be here among people who understand the importance of the tobacco issue, and it's a special pleasure because we in Canada have benefited from real leadership on tobacco control and also outstanding research. And many of the health gains that we've done in Canada could not have been accomplished in the absence of that assistance coming from our American friends. However, we are all lucky, I must say. Let's just move this on. We're all lucky because we are standing on the shoulders of giants. And I have to tell you, I'd like to pay tribute to two or three American giants. I wish I could go into detail about these. But of course, Luther Terry, the first Surgeon General, who introduced that blockbuster report establishing the causal relationship between tobacco and lung cancer in 1964. I'm especially I have an affection for him because he agreed to be on my honorary board of directors when I set up the Non-Smokers' Rights Association way back in the mid-1970s. And so to receive an honor in his memory at the Luther Terry Awards was fabulous. And then Emerson Foote. You folks probably don't know Emerson Foote, but Emerson Foote was a legend in the advertising industry. He was president and chairman of the board of McCann Erickson, which was the second largest advertising agency in the world. And they had a lot of tobacco clients. But Emerson Foote was asked by the president to be the head of the communications subcommittee on cancer, heart disease, and stroke, which led to the Surgeon General's report. And when he met Luther Terry and others and learned of how devastating tobacco was, he went to the board of McCann Erickson and asked the board to turn down the business from the tobacco industry. In other words, to get out of the tobacco advertising business. They didn't go along with it, and Emerson Foote resigned based on his ethics and his morals. And he was blackballed by the advertising industry for that. He was blackballed. And I can tell you, he was not a wealthy man at that point. He served as a volunteer chairman of the first and the United States National Coalition or Conference on Smoking or Health way back in the late 1960s. He was a giant. And I'll always remember Emerson Foote. He was also on my honorary board of directors when I established the NSRA. Hubert Humphrey III, the courageous Attorney General in Minnesota, who is largely responsible for 35 million pages of tobacco industry documents through the Minnesota litigation coming on into the public domain. Merrill Williams, well, Jim Rapace, dear friend, he stayed at my home. His monumental research on secondhand smoke always had a quote in it. He knew how to write not only good research, but he also knew how to write an advocacy quote into that research that could be lifted and used places. And his influence was enormous, and the tobacco industry hates him. Merrill Williams. Merrill Williams was a paralegal who was hired to examine tobacco industry documents for litigation. When he read those documents, he realized that there was civil and criminal, civil misconduct and criminal activity, that arguably criminal activity that was involved. And he smuggled documents out of Brown and Williamson in his back brace, photocopied them and took them back in the next day, violating his contractual obligation to the company. But he felt his ethical obligations and moral obligations transcended his contractual obligations to the company. That took huge courage. He was hurt severely by that, but those are the leaks that led to the major litigation in the United States. Dalit Bal, the outstanding head of the chronic disease division in the California state government. Dalit Bao was the guy who brought forward the granddaddy of all the mass media campaigns. Dalit Bao, a dear friend of mine and a huge leader. Stanton Glantz, I'm not going to say anything about Stanton. He's everywhere. He's a real giant. And Sharon Eubanks, the courageous lawyer in the U.S. Department of Justice who led that litigation effort against big tobacco, going up against the major litigators in the United States and fighting the Bush administration at the same time that was trying to kill the legislation. What she did is monumental. I recommend her book, Bad Acts, the case against, the racketeering. I've forgotten the subhead, but Bad Acts by Sharon Eubanks. If you want to know what goes on in government and what the problems are that they face, there's the book. She tells all the stories, and she doesn't, she names names, she doesn't fool around. Now, having said that, I have to explain and give credit where it's due. I helped set up Canada's Non-Smokers' Rights Association about 37 years ago, and I was the executive director for most of that time. Most of the advocacy work that I will talk about today was the work of the Non-Smokers' Rights Association. When the federal government in Canada cut our grant, we lost about 40% of our income. And so to protect jobs within the organization, to create the salary space, I left the NSRA and set up a new advocacy organization, the Campaign for Justice on Tobacco Fraud. And so that's where I hang my hat. Now, when I was invited to speak here today, I had to come up with a title for my talk. So the first draft, Umpteen Reasons Why Tobacco Executives Should Be Drawn and Quartered, a charitable commentary. Now, having someone drawn and quartered is pretty severe punishment, but I believe in punishment which is proportional to the offense. I make it clear, I am absolutely opposed to capital punishment. But knowing what big tobacco is responsible for, I'm inclined to make an exception for tobacco executives. You know, when I thought about that, then I came to my senses and remembered that in Canada, the homicide rate has dropped significantly since Canada banned capital punishment in 1967. The homicide rate has actually gone down. So obviously, you know, I'm kidding about the drawing and quartering, but that particular punishment does meet the test of proportionality when you look at bad behavior. So 1 million deaths in Canada. By the way, there's drawing and quartering. I forgot to show you just exactly what is involved in when you draw and quarter somebody. It hasn't taken place for a little while, but anyway, I thought about it for tobacco executives. 1 million tobacco deaths in Canada, you can multiply just about all the time, you can multiply by 10 to get some kind of an estimate of what might have happened in the United States. I think it's much more than this. I think my estimate is quite low. It's estimated that tobacco industry fraud, conspiracy, and negligence has caused or contributed to over 1 million deaths in Canada. The magnitude of the problem. The World Health Organization some time ago estimated that the tobacco industry will kill 500 million people presently alive. Another fellow who has become a good friend of mine, Mort Mintz, I had lunch with him a year ago in Washington. Mort Mintz was an investigative journalist with the Washington Post. Mort was on the same investigative team as Woodward and Bernstein, the guys who broke the Watergate scandal. And he specialized in the tobacco, Mort specialized in tobacco and the pharmaceutical industries. And he came up to me after one of these plenary addresses at a world conference, and he said, the number is so big, give me something that will enable my readers to understand how big the numbers are. And I said, well, Mort, the highest estimate of casualties, both military and civilian, during the entire world war, the highest estimate is 60 million. So what we're talking about is 8 times that number of deaths caused by tobacco industry products from among people presently alive. And of course, it's worse than that, because now they're talking about the industry causing 1 billion deaths during this century. So when you look at this, given the terrible statistics, why don't governments treat the tobacco epidemic with the strong measures that they treat other epidemics? And of course, when you look at the agents for major epidemics, you look at malaria, and of course you focus on the mosquito. With cholera, and there are still cholera outbreaks in the world, you look at infected water. With bubonic plague, it's rats. With the tobacco epidemic, it's also rats. And the trick is to focus on the major epidemics. The head of the World Health Organization said one time, "Why is the tobacco industry like a mosquito?" And she answered, "Because both are blood-sucking, disease-spreading parasites which cause epidemics." So it's a good quote to remember. What is unique about the tobacco industry is the fact that at the root of the epidemic is civil misconduct and arguably criminal behavior. It's really about conspiracy and fraud. And what most people, I've found that even people in the health professions do not know the story of how all of this started, all the litigation started, what was the cause of action. It all started in a infamous meeting in 1953 in the Plaza Hotel on Central Park in New York City, when the heads of the major tobacco industries got together and planned their strategy. And what was their strategy? By the way, this story is told by the former New York Times specialist in tobacco, Phil Hiltz. He received the leaked documents that Merrill Williams smuggled out in his back brace, and they planned at that time to deal with the evidence coming out in a pretty dramatic way, and it involved fraud. So what is fraud? Fraud is an act of trickery or deceit, an intentional false representation, a concealment or non-disclosure to induce a person who is relying on disclosure to give up something valuable, a legal right, property, or money, or in this case, health. By the way, at the end, my PowerPoints are going to be all available for you. You don't have to worry if you're interested in taking notes. You can relax and pick up the PowerPoint at the end, and if there is anything that I've said that is of value, you'll find it outlined there. So that's what fraud is. So the plan in that hotel room was to spend large amounts of money. This is Phil Hiltz, and I recommend that book, by the way, Smokescreen. The plan was to spend large amounts of money every year indefinitely into the future to prevent scientists and public health officers from warning people of a potential hazard. There is no case like it in the annals of business or health. And so what you see, despite all of this, the plan was to confuse the government, create controversy, fool public science and the public. And the plan rolled out over 5 decades. And here's an example of a manifestation of that plan. Here's the tobacco executives in one of the most famous pictures ever published, swearing that tobacco is not addictive. All of them made a statement like this: I believe tobacco is not addictive. That's the head of British American Tobacco. And here's another statement from Martin Broughton, British American Tobacco CEO. "We have not concealed, we do not conceal, and we will not conceal, and we will never conceal. We have no internal research which proves that smoking is addictive. Can you believe that? But that's what this guy was saying as recently as 1996. You want to understand how this happens? This is one quote. Remember this one. Upton Sinclair famously noted how difficult it is, open quote, to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it. That explains a lot of what goes on in tobacco control. A lot of what's behind the tragedy. Now I come to one of the most devastating documents that I've ever seen in tobacco control. This is Kendrick Wells. Listen to what Kendrick Wells, or look at what Kendrick Wells had to say. If we admit that smoking is harmful to heavy smokers, do we not admit that BAT has killed a lot of people each year for a very long time? Moreover, if the evidence we have today is not significantly different from the evidence we had 5 years ago, might it not be argued that we have been willfully killing our customers for this long period? Aside from the catastrophic civil damage and governmental regulation which would flow from such an admission, I foresee serious criminal liability problems. Way back, this is what they were saying behind closed doors. Here's another beautiful one. We had no proof that our products did not cause cancer. A 50% death rate from the product is acceptable. Can you believe? This is a guy who was in that 1953 hotel room meeting when the strategy was planned. Targeting women. I actually I took a women's studies course in university. I don't know whether it did any good or not, but I was interested in the subject, still am. And so when I saw this document about targeting women, they find it harder to stop smoking. It may be related to the observations that women are more neurotic than men. Now, something like that, wouldn't that make most women want to go to the barricades? I mean, it's not my gender, but oh my God, that would infuriate me. But anyway, that's what the way they were talking about their customers. And how callous is this? R.J. Reynolds, Chairman Charles Harper, told shareholders, open quote, said this in a public meeting of shareholders in the media. If children don't like to be in a smoky room, they'll leave. When asked about infants who can't leave, Harper replied, at some point they begin to crawl. That's the mentality of the people that we are dealing with. So what Big Tobacco planned in that hotel room was a racket. What is a racket? A racket is a fraudulent scheme, enterprise, or activity, an illegitimate enterprise. Racketeering is a system of obtaining money or other advantage illegally, fraudulently, or undeservedly. Law professor Robert Blakey makes the case, and by the way, I think this is on the Non-Smokers' Rights Association website. He makes the case that Big Tobacco has behaved just like organized crime. What do the smoke folk, the book I brought here as a sample, you can take a look at it, is what do the smoke folk have in common with organized crime? It's one of our publications that I'm particularly fond about. Now, who is Robert Blakey? Robert Blakey was the American professor from Notre Dame who was the principal draftsman of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act in the United States. So he knows a little bit about whereof he speaks. And here's what Blakey had to say on tobacco. It's illegitimate and illegitimately marketed. This is not a legal product when sold to children. It's the same thing functionally as cocaine and heroin. This is a drug industry, not a tobacco industry. RICO was designed to deal with the illegal drug industry. And so he framed the racketeering complaint, civil action that the U.S. Department of Justice took against Big Tobacco, United States of America, and the American Cancer Society versus Philip Morris and the others. In that momentous system or decision, 1,700-page decision by Judge Kessler, I frame this. I use this everywhere. It's in the book that I just described. She said, over the course of more than 50 years, defendants lied, misrepresented, and deceived the American public about the devastating health effects of smoking and environmental tobacco smoke. They suppressed research, they destroyed documents, they manipulated the use of nicotine so as to increase and perpetuate addiction. They distorted the truth about low tar and light cigarettes so as to discourage smokers from quitting, and they abused the legal system in order to achieve their goal. The lawyers were involved in the fraud and the conspiracy. To make money with little, if any, regard for individual illness and suffering, soaring health costs, or the integrity of the legal system, the evidence of defendants' fraud is overwhelming. Wow. So, in light of the fact that I'm coming to Johns Hopkins, despite this ugly behavior, I decided I had to tone down the first draft of my title and produce something more sedate. So this is the one I've used for my talk today, Why Sweet Reason is Seldom Enough When Addressing Industry-Driven Epidemics, Applying Social Change Principles to the Campaign Against Big Tobacco in Canada. Dilip Bal, the hero I mentioned before, Dilip Bal said, this is war. You cannot win this war without taking the industry on, head on. And I must say that we've tried, some of us in Canada have tried to go to war against big tobacco. We led campaigns for Canada's world precedent-setting ban on tobacco advertising and promotion. The NSRA, the world precedent-setting warnings that came out of Canada in 1994 were designed, I designed them, they were designed in my office, and I persuaded the health minister to push them. The ones that were designed or that came out in 2000, which really were world precedent-setting. The prototype of that I'm going to show you in a few minutes, but it was designed in our office. So we've had some influence on policy. We think that's a bit of a sign that we're willing to go to war. But here are my stages of social change learned years ago. And I break it down this way: the thesis, the antithesis, polarization, neutralization, mobilization, and synthesis. So what does all this mean? Thesis is the identification of the problem. In other words, in our case with tobacco, it's the absence of the real blockbuster changes that would be needed to deal with the tobacco reform. Research is key. It must be adequate to create pressure for policy change and law reform. And that's the first stage. If there's opposition, and this is when you define the problem, if there's opposition, if there is no opposition to the problem, there's going to be a remedy, and sweet reason will prevail, and the issue will be resolved because there's no opposition. Everybody's in agreement. So your thesis, you don't have to go further on the social change. You're there. But most often, we enter the antithesis or opposition stage, and pushback emerges. Pushback usually takes this form. More research is required, or research is inconclusive, or people will come out and say there's going to be, it's not proven, or there's going to be a loss of jobs, or it's unconstitutional, or we're going to get on a slippery slope. You've heard them all. But that's usually the antithesis stage. Then you go into, again, that's the appearance of fronts in junk science. I forgot to mention that. That's absolutely critical. You see this in the climate change issue now, the junk science and the fronts being developed, the think tanks and whatever. When that occurs, then you're into a stage that you have to go through polarization and neutralization, or you won't get to your new reform. I guarantee you it won't happen, because you've already shown that sweet reason isn't enough when the problem was identified. You've got real pushback, and you're going to have to deal with it. So this is where you identify those who have declared in favor of the reforms and the bad guys, those clearly against. In this stage, we targeted, at the NSRA, we targeted organizations that had not taken a stand, those in the spectator stands instead of on the playing field moving the yardsticks. No more in the mushy middle. And I'm going to give you some examples of what we're talking about, but they weren't going to have the choice of not playing. So in the late 1970s, when I found out the Canadian Cancer Society and the Heart Foundation and the Lung Association did not want to touch tobacco advocacy with a 10-foot pole, and the Cancer Society said, we have to teach this guy here in this meeting today. I heard them, I was standing there, I overheard it. We're going to have to let this Garfield Mahood know today that the Cancer Society is not an anti-smoking organization. That's back in the late 1970s. And so I took the issue into the press. They hated me for about 10 years. They hated me before they changed. But the fact is, I took them on. And the interesting part about it was 10 years later, the Cancer Society gave me one of its highest awards, which indicated how far they had progressed. I'm going to give you another example. The Canadian Lung Association, we published a full-page ad in about 1983 that focused on the tobacco industry's sponsorship of the Canadian ski championships. And the Canadian Lung Association wouldn't sign on to that ad. So I put all the people who were signing and endorsing the ad, and then I had a line at the bottom that said the Canadian Lung Association refused to sign this ad. And all hell broke loose. They had an emergency meeting of their board of directors, and I can tell you, they signed on to my ads faster. They were the first to sign on in virtually every case from then on. Wow, did that ever change behavior? But we took them on, we polarized, we made things happen. Neutralization is the identification of opponents, public shaming, exposure of fronts, neutralizing the values of the bad guys, you involve investigative journalists. I mean, you do whatever is necessary. You're going to take out the opposition. You're going to make it too painful for the opposition to stay in one position. And this is where I've had a lot of fun. So here was a cheap thing that didn't cost anything. I got a great big ham bone at the supermarket and put it on a trophy. And we made the Boner of the Year award. And there was a scientist who was on the Toronto City Council arguing that secondhand smoke wasn't a health hazard. Richard Gilbert was on the City Council. He was also a scientist with the Addiction Research Foundation, and he was on the health board. And so he was creating problems for us everywhere. And we wrote articles about him and whatnot, and he kept going. He was also a smoker, by the way. Anyway, so we arranged to ambush him. And we told the press we were going to ambush him, so the television cameras were there, and the radio people and the press people with their photographers. And he stepped off the elevators at City Hall, and the founder of my organization, a lovely lady, handed him this Boner of the Year award. And it went all over the press. And from then on, Richard Gilbert he just had no legitimacy. Every time he opened his mouth, he had been taken out of the action. Here's another one. The Fraser Institute is one of those think tanks like the Cato Institute or the Heritage Foundation, which is funded by the tobacco industry, causing all kinds of trouble. So they had a big meeting in Toronto, a big, not a convention, but there were a lot of people going to be there. So in less than 24 hours, we put together this takeout on the Fraser Institute, economic think tank or front for the tobacco industry. Then we snuck our people into the meeting. We paid their way in. They took a whole bunch of these reports in and put them on every chair in that particular engagement. And we killed their publicity. They got bad publicity from our report, but we knocked them out with that effort. That kind of thing has to happen all the time. when the tobacco industry set up a meeting in a major hotel to announce Coalition 51 in opposition to the ad ban, the press weren't told that Rothman, Spencer, and Hedges paid for the entire meeting. David Nosbacken and I, David Nosbacken was with the Cancer Society, we rented the room right across from their press conference room, and nobody knew that we had done it. We rented the room, and as soon as all the press walked out of the one meeting, we handed them a sheet of paper saying our press conference was now starting in the other room. And we blew them out of the water. That press conference had huge publicity. So a little strategy, good timing, some aggressiveness, and a willingness to play hardball, and we had some fun with these people. This is one that you should be familiar with. How many of you have seen the book Passive Smoke, the Environmental Protection Agency's Betrayal of Science and Policy? All right. Well, this is a book that the tobacco industry was responsible for. John Lewick was the principal author. Geo Gorey is a former National Cancer Institute or American Cancer Society official who went to the dark side. John Lewick was a Rhodes Scholar, but he was also a defrocked academic. He was thrown out of 2 universities in Canada for academic misconduct. The vice chancellor at one of the universities said it was the worst case of academic fraud that he had ever seen. These are the 2 guys that produced this book, attacking the Environmental Protection Agency for declaring secondhand smoke as a Class A or Group 1 carcinogen. And they couldn't get it published in the States, so they went to the Fraser Institute in Canada. That gave this defrocked academic Lewick a base, and they published this book. It took me 4 years, but we finally took John Lewick out. I took investigative journalists from Toronto to the 2 universities where Lewick had stayed. We managed to get the academic case of fraud out of Brock University and gave it to the press, and we got the story. It was a documentary on national television, and I got CBC National Television to agree to allow the media, or the print media, to do a story on him the same day, because I wanted something in print, something that was really permanent that we could refer to. And so the Montreal Gazette did a full-page, front-page article, started on front page, full page inside, and they just destroyed this guy. And it took 4 years to make that happen, but we got the son of a bitch. And that's the kind of hardball that you have to play with these folks, because guess what? They're not nice folks, and they deserve to, they deserve all the nice things that you can get. Here's another one. This is real fun. This guy, John Bryden, was a smoker. He was a member of Parliament, and he was attacking the charitable sector in Canada, accusing the charitable sector of all horrendous things. Now, there is no question that there are fraudsters in the charitable sector, but 98%, 99% of these people are trying to do a good job. They're decent people, and they're working hard to improve society. And yeah, there's flaws. But this guy, Bryden, he went after the Non-Smokers' Rights Association and the other tobacco-specific tobacco control organizations in Canada. And nobody would go after the guy. They all tried to work nicely, sweet reason behind the scenes. And this guy, the media loved the conflict, and they just played this guy up and gave him legitimacy. And at some point, he libeled one of the other tobacco control organizations, and they wouldn't go after him. So I just decided, guess what, Mr. Bryden? He actually called my office and tried to get information about the NSRA from one of my staff, and they turned it over. And when I realized who it was and what he was doing, I said to him, I said, John, if you called here to create trouble, I said, if you want a war, I'll give you a war. You can count on me giving you a war. I'm one guy that'll go after you. And I guess he thought maybe we were fooling. So we went after him. This is the ad that we published in the newspaper in our national capital. I'll pass it around, or you can take a look at it at the end. Have you no sense of decency, Mr. Bryden? how far are you prepared to go with your special interest disinformation campaign? And I can tell you, this is hard-hitting. And to give legitimacy, and so there were no footprints, here are the people who paid for the ad. And they are physicians and chiefs and professors of medicine and professors of public health and professors of law. And it took 2 columns to have these people all listed right beside the ad. No footprints. The ad was shown on national television, on all 3 major networks. And this guy was taken out as cleanly and as beautifully as you could ever imagine. But Mr. Bryden got his war. All right. The next little example. I got to be careful. Got to watch the time here. You'll be raising the red flag here. And oh my God! Look at how. It's all your fault. It was your introduction. Anyway, St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto. St. Mike's, took a large donation from the tobacco industry to fund a program in corporate social responsibility. That was too much. So we published a 4-page ad in the university newspaper. That's all you need to do to deal with this kind of stuff. And we said possible sources for funding for St. Mike's. Well, for example, if they were setting up a race relations program, they could go to a neo-Nazi party and get funding, or for a program on African studies, they could go to the Ku Klux Klan, they could get money there. For human rights, they might go to Slobodan Milosevic, who's before the International Criminal Court at the present time, or for corporate social responsibility, they could go for big tobacco. So we had a little bit of fun. This was the masterstroke of the campaign for the Tobacco Products Control Act. And it sets it out nicely. How many thousands of Canadians will die from tobacco industry products may largely be in the hands of these 2 men. This, again, was the masterstroke of the campaign. The legislation was before a parliamentary committee for clause-by-clause reading on a Monday morning. This ad did not exist on the previous Thursday. What was the problem? The Prime Minister, it was his legislation, but the head of the Canadian Tobacco Manufacturers Council was a guy by the name of Bill Neville. Neville ran the Prime Minister's campaign to get him elected. He set up, he was the head of the transition team that put the Prime Minister in his office and got him all established. He could pick up the phone at any time, phone the Prime Minister and get him on the phone. And the word came down from the Health Minister's office that there was a move afoot to gut this legislation. And the Health Minister's aide, off the record, I can say it now, said, we need this dealt with, and there's only 2 or 3 days to do it. So this ad was published in less than 72 hours, and with a major list of people on the bottom. And what we simply said is every concession, Prime Minister, that you give to this, your friend, will result in thousands of deaths. And every concession that this man Neville extracts from the Prime Minister will lead to tens of thousands of deaths. What position will you take? It was enormous. So there are things you can do. Now, mobilization is setting up advocacy organizations, ad hoc groups, coalitions where needed. And don't be afraid to steal from the tobacco industry's playbook. So I'm going to just show you one thing. You can come up and take a look at it. Health Canada, when they came up with their idea for the new warnings in 1999, they were terrible. They were terrible. It was just, I showed the flaws to the media, and the media laughed. I made them laugh. So we produced the prototype for a new warning system. And we actually, you can come up and take a look at it after it's over, we actually produced Canada's world precedent setting the prototype for the system with the interior warning system, the whole works. And when we held our press conference and announced this, I tell you, I'm not kidding, it was on page 1, 2, or 3 of every newspaper in the country. It made all television newscasts. We raised the level of expectations for the new warning system. And we set the bar. We raised the bar. And when the new warnings came out, they incorporated many of the things that we put in our black box campaign. And that's a case, and remember what I said about mobilization, or what I'm talking about. On the inside of the box, look at the number of Canadian organizations that were behind this effort. And on the back, we had so many, we had to continue them on the back. So that's where the mobilization takes place. Now, synthesis, of course, is where the various interests come together, and you've got your consensus about your law reform or your regulation, and if it's flawed, guess what? If there's inadequacies and it's not corrected by sweet reason or strong adequacy, then you're back to your thesis stage and you're into amendments for the legislation, and you're full circle and you come back again. So how are we doing? Who has to go to class in a hurry? Who has to leave? Who wants to leave? Everybody got to get up and go out. The reason I say this, are there any questions, right off the top, something that comes to mind? Normally what I do at this stage is I get everybody up and do some aerobics, just to keep them active so they don't go to sleep. I won't put you through that. But Joanne has seen me, I'm sure has seen me do that before. But anyway, Professor Cohen, excuse me. Anyway, the reason I say this, one thing I haven't talked about, which is, in my opinion, arguably one of the 4 top tobacco control health strategies, which is absolutely critical if we're ever going to get to the blockbuster reforms, the serious game-changer reforms that are necessary. And it's because we have to deal with the normalization of the tobacco industry in our society. So can I take 5 minutes to give a go at that, Professor Cohen? Thank you. How did the tobacco industry normalize itself, make itself part of the legitimate business community when its products were killing a staggering 1 out of 2 of their long-term users? Efforts have to be made to neutralize industry efforts at a normalization. And how did they do it? Lies and deception, promoting smoking in movies, product placement, donations, political contributions, sponsorships, infiltration of decision-making bodies, corporate responsibility tactics, creating fronts and funding think tanks and junk science. That's how they did it. So TID, tobacco industry denormalization, is a critical component of any comprehensive tobacco control plan. And it's nothing more than telling the truth about the industrial source of the tobacco epidemic. The tobacco industry has protected itself. Reporters would come to me and they would say, if the stats are as bad as you say they are, how come, and they knew this 50 years ago, how come the problem is still there? I mean, when you think about it, it's staggering. How come the problem is still there? And I've always said, it's because of this legitimacy, this normalcy, that the tobacco industry has to be granted all the other legal rights and whatnot that any other industry has. And tobacco industry denormalization, I don't know how I've said it here, it's protected itself by the belief that it is a normal legal industry selling a normal legal product. Tobacco industry denormalization is the reversal of this process, telling people why this industry falls outside the bounds of normal, legitimate industry. It's nothing more complicated than stripping the industry and its products of normalcy. It is telling the truth to address an epidemic. Now, the tobacco, I underline this, and by the way, at the front, when it's all over, I've got my report on tobacco industry denormalization and an interesting press release that was released at the time the report came out. So you can pick this all up at the front. But this is a critical part of it. Tobacco industry denormalization is not the deglamorization of smoking. It is not denormalization of tobacco use or a focus on individual behavior. That's something that they tried 50 years ago and it was unsuccessful, and they called it changing the social acceptability of smoking. If it was just changing the social acceptability of smoking, there's nothing new in that. That's why it's not the denormalization of individual behavior. It is not a blame the victim, stop smoking strategy. And there's the booklet that is up at the front that you can pick up that goes into detail on this. How important is tobacco industry denormalization? This was the creative genius behind the granddaddy of all of the mass media campaigns. The success of a mass media campaign will, open quote, rest on the concrete, on the granite, on the bedrock of an anti-industry strategy. If you don't have that bedrock, your campaign will ultimately fail. And the beautiful California groundbreaking campaign had as its theme, the tobacco industry is not your friend. Think of how different that is from the other mass media campaigns that have been promoted. Here's what the California report, one of the California reports said. The deglamorizing strategy, that's what they called it, exposes the business side of the tobacco industry and repositions tobacco marketers as part of the problem. The strategy encourages kids to rebel against the tobacco companies. And here's the example. This was on their billboards. The tobacco industry is not your friend. So how does it work? By changing social attitudes towards the industry and increasing public support for tobacco-related legislative reform. By countering industry disinformation, by transferring teen rebellion to the industry, by increasing the self-worth of smokers. It's amazing. When they realize that the industry addicted them as children and that was a fraud, they transfer, they feel better, but they don't feel this terrible, you know, I've failed, I can't quit smoking. And some of that anger is then transferred legitimately onto the industry. And that self-worth works in the favor of public health. Of course, it reframes the debate. Stanton Glantz, the hero I mentioned at the beginning, had this to say: distrusting the tobacco industry is a strong predictor of quit attempts. If a non-smoker has a high level of distrust of the tobacco industry, it cuts the odds of being a smoker by a factor of 4. And he also said, if a person is a smoker, distrust of the tobacco industry increases the odds that you will have a quit attempt in the next month by a factor of 4. That's huge. TID tactics, changing the language of tobacco control, letters to editors, social media, and, you know, the whole divestment of tobacco stock. You can all see this in the handout. And I'm going to give you one example that we talked about last night at a dinner. Changing the language. What people say now is smoking kills 443,000 or 440,000 Americans every year. Imagine what happens when you change the language and you say tobacco industry products kill 440,000 Americans every year. Imagine on a warning, instead of saying smoking causes lung cancer, the warning says this product causes lung cancer. You've got to recapture the language of tobacco control and take it away from the tobacco industry. And it starts right here with the way we describe what we use as the cause of the epidemic. Industry objectives in the longer term. Remember I said taking the legitimacy away from the industry is key to this? Here's what the head of the Canadian Tobacco Manufacturers Council wrote in a secret tobacco document. To re-legitimize the industry in the eyes of the government, interest groups, and the general public, and thus to reposition the industry as a legitimate participant in tobacco policy making. They recognized that this was going on and they had to deal with this. So they made it an industry objective in the long term. All right, how do we take the conflict to the next level? Recognize that tobacco control is political. Sweet reason is not enough. Governments are brokers. They're not always your friends in health departments. And marginalize the industry. Governments, a main campaign principle of mine, governments are like footballs. They move up and down the legislative playing field dependent upon the muscle you apply and how hard you kick them. And if you don't understand that, you won't get anywhere. And the final slide, Professor Cohen says, hooray. The final slide is, man is the only animal that blushes or needs to. Mark Twain. And remember, this epidemic, it's almost all of it has been led by men. And women have to get angry and get aggressive on this issue because it's guys that have done it. And I'm not proud of my gender for the role that is played in the tobacco industry, so I'm trying to do my small part to fix it. Thank you very much. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know how familiar you are with what's going on in the U.S. with our graphic warning labels, but I'm curious from what you know and from Canada's experience with this, what do you think are our next steps in getting the graphic warning labels actually in place?
Well, you're locked into a court process, which makes it difficult. There is a difference apparently in the way Canadian courts have approached this. Canadian courts have almost always sided on the part of public health. And the reason for that is that you can repair, if it's a financial issue, you can repair somebody's balance sheet. But if people get sick or die because of a health measure being blocked by the courts, you can't bring lives back, you can't bring health back. So the courts have been very reluctant to step in and stay a piece of legislation, block a piece of legislation, because litigation can cause it to be held up for years and years and years. So the tobacco industry went after us in Canada over the warnings, and they lost. And the warnings went ahead. And so there simply was no delay in implementation. Now, what do you do with that? In the meantime, we'll have to have a separate meeting. That's a long discussion. I'll give you, anybody wants my business card, they can get it. You can give me a call. Anyway, that's not a good answer, but that's the best I can do on the spur of the moment. Yes?
With reframing the issue towards being anti-industry rather than anti-smoking, do you run the risk of making it so that smoking at its core doesn't seem dangerous, and the idea of homegrown, home-cured, like tobacco being a source that's not dangerous? I mean, the actual, like, tobacco existed before the industry existed, and so, like, how do you address that sort of?
To be frank, it's never been a problem, because whenever you're talking about fraud and conspiracy and negligence, you're talking about the devastating harm. So you never, that never is taken out of the play, out of the conversation. If anything, it increases the learning about the magnitude of the risk. One of my criticisms of the American warnings which were planned is that in a good tobacco warning, you have to talk about both the nature of the risk, which, let's use lung cancer as an example. So you have to identify the risk. You know, cigarettes cause lung cancer, tobacco causes lung cancer. I don't like it, but smoking causes lung cancer. But there's a second part of the warning that is absolutely essential, and that is the magnitude of the risk. If you get lung cancer, it's ball game over in most cases. Once the symptoms appear, it's a death warrant. So I think in the process of talking about the warnings and the importance of the warnings and whatnot, you can't help but elevate the discussion about their importance, and you're not. I don't believe, if I've understood you correctly, I don't believe that you'll go into the area that might be a concern. Any other questions?
I think we're going to have to end it there.
One more. Quickie, quick.
I'm going to ask, because I don't know if the room is being used for another class. So there are all the materials that Gar mentioned up here. Come and help yourself. He will be here for a few minutes if you have some questions. And I just wanted to thank you, Gar, on behalf of all of us for sharing